Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Virtual Executive Director Podcast. My name is Becky Caldwell, and I'm your host. I'm an executive coach for creative souls, and I can hardly wait to bring you this week's episode. Here we are, sliding into the back half of 2020, and I am finally ready to announce my new coaching program for creators. It's called The Labyrinth. This is a program specifically for creators, creative entrepreneurs, and creative souls. This is a one-on-one program, so it's you and me directly for a minimum of 3 months. I use the mantra of the Labyrinth, which is release, receive, return, to guide our sessions. So far, my most successful clients have come to me when they are building or birthing something new, and they need to shed old habits, old beliefs, old thought patterns in order to fully realize their new creation. If this sounds like you, fill out the application linked here in the show notes. And if I think we're a good fit, I'll contact you to schedule a quick call. And guys, don't worry about the call. It's not a high-pressure sales situation because I'm the one interviewing you. This week's summer rerun is an interview I did with Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. Now, whether you're a rock star decision maker or you can't choose whether to send a text or an email, Dr. Tsipursky is here to help us all get better at making decisions both for ourselves and for our organizations as part of a team. He is known as the disaster avoidance expert, and he is on a mission to protect leaders from dangerous judgment errors known as cognitive biases by developing the most effective decision-making strategies. He has over 2 decades of consulting, coaching, and training experience as CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts and over 15 years of experience in academia as a cognitive neuroscientist and behavioral economist. Dr. Tsipursky writes for Inc. magazine, Time, Scientific American, Fast Company, and Psychology Today. A best-selling author, his book is Never Go With Your Gut: How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. We are here with Dr. Gleb Tsipursky, and he is the author of Never Go With Your Gut: How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. And in fact, I guess your business is disaster avoidance, right?
That's right. That's my expertise. I help nonprofit leaders and for-profit leaders avoid disasters in all sorts of areas, especially in the areas of human decision making, because we tend to make very bad mistakes when we decide about other people, but also when we make strategy, long-term plans, we also make a lot of bad mistakes in those areas. So my expertise is not disaster management. I don't come in and deal with a disaster. I try to avoid a disaster. It's like Ben Franklin said, ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But too few nonprofit leaders actually work on the ounce of prevention, and then they have to have the pound of cure or the ton of cure, depending on the situation.
Yes, absolutely. I think because we're so strapped for cash and time, and it's hard to carve out the time to for prevention, right?
You're not the
And
only ones. I see entrepreneurs, let's say startup leaders, they're also strapped for cash and time.
mm,
And there are lots of leaders who are strapped for cash and time. And the problem is they don't realize how much cash and time they're spending by
mm,
dealing with fires, fighting with fires that could be prevented if they addressed problems in advance. A key person leaving, how prepared are you for that? Well, you can be prepared and you can avoid the incredible pain and suffering that's caused by a super key person leaving or so many other problems that you didn't anticipate by using effective strategies to address these problems in advance.
okay. Well, okay. Before we dive into what some of those
Hmm.
strategies are, and I love that in your book you actually list out like where organizations go horribly wrong. I love that you list that out and enumerate that for everyone. But how did you get started in this?
Well, I got into it actually as a kid. What motivated me was seeing my parents making some bad decisions with each other, with relating to each other. The typical decision-making process that everyone takes, because that's what they've been advised, is to go with their gut intuitions, their gut reactions. That's very bad, dangerous, harmful in many ways. But my parents followed that decision-making process, so what does it mean to go with your gut? It means when you feel something is right, you believe it's right and you do it. That's what gut reaction means. So they felt something was right and then they went ahead and did it. Unfortunately, what they felt was right was often at odds with each other, as it so often is. So, for example, my mom liked to buy nice clothing. So she'd go out and buy a $50 sweater. And my dad was kind of a cheapskate. So he'd yell at her when she came home and say, no, sweater should be worth over $20, something like that. So already as a kid, I saw that that wasn't good for their relationships. They had a lot of conflicts, a lot of tensions, a lot of stress that I didn't think they needed to have. But the worst time was actually with my dad. So he was a real estate agent, and his salary was variable because it was based on commissions. So there was about a 6-month period when he made a lot of money, but he told my mom that he made very little money, probably because he didn't want her to spend it on sweaters, and he actually hid the money and bought an apartment elsewhere and leased it out to some people. So in a couple of years, my mom found out about this situation and she was very angry. She was very pissed. They had a big, huge, big blowout fight and they actually separated for a while. So I ended up living with with my mom, and I didn't see my dad frequently. And that was pretty stressful for me. That was tough as a kid to see that my parents separating, having so much stress and so many negative emotions. I mean, they eventually reconciled, but she could never really trust him again. So, with that in mind, I always saw that my parents really weren't gods, and adults weren't gods. They make terrible decisions all the time, and it made me fascinated with how and why we make our decisions. I mean, my parents never sat me down and said, "Hey, kiddo, this is how you make decisions." And in school, I was never taught to, I was taught geography and history and math. I wasn't taught to, here's how you make your decisions. And so that was something that was very weird to me. That why aren't we taught to how to make decisions? Why is this not something that's part of our basic education? And so I decided to research this, and I started studying this topic. How do we make decisions? Started improving my own decision-making processes. Then people started noticing that, hey, I'm making good decisions, and I started doing presentations about this, training, went into coaching, then consulting, and I've been doing training, consulting, coaching for the last 20 years or so.
Oh, okay.
And so that's kind of how I got into that. Now, at the same time, as a little bit into my education on decision making, I realized that their popular literature on decision making, whatever was available, really was not nearly enough to get me to where I wanted to go, to really understand how our brain causes us to make certain decisions. So I went into academia, formally studying decision making, the field of cognitive neuroscience and behavioral economics. So I became a cognitive neuroscientist, which cognitive neuroscience refers to studying how the various parts of our brain shape our behavior, shape how we behave. And of course, decision making is a subcomponent of that. So it's decision sciences. And specifically, what I was interested in is economic behaviors. How do we behave as economic beings? And that's the behavioral economics part of it. And so I've been doing that for about 15 years. And so I've been a moonlighting academic, so to speak, as many people are, who are academics and who are in that sort of decision sciences, behavioral economics. And the book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, that we're here to talk about, is the culmination of my experience consulting in nonprofits, ranging from the World Wildlife Fund and the Columbus Foundation, and for-profits ranging from Aflac to Xerox, and all of my education in actual academia and research in academia, primary source research. So that's kind of my background, and that's where I am right now.
You are for sure the first neuroscientist I've had on the podcast. And I'm really excited.
I'm glad to be the first one.
Oh my gosh, Gleb, so many questions just like popped into my head as you were talking. Let me just blurt some of them out and then we'll kind of go through them maybe a little bit more methodically.
Sure.
But like, as you're talking about how humans make decisions, I'm wondering like, how do we as individuals make decisions, how, like, where do we do it badly, where can we be better at it, and then as a group, because as a nonprofit we work with boards and volunteers and we have
Yes.
staff, and how do we make decisions as a group. And then I'm also like, when you talked about economic behaviors, is there anything we can use from that to apply to how we approach donors
Yes.
and potential funders? And then I'm dying to know about the training you just came back from with the World Wildlife Fund.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe now that I've gotten all of that out of my head and
Sure.
into the recording, let's start with individuals. First of all, why are we so bad at it, at making decisions?
Well, the problem comes from the fact that our brains, our feelings, our emotions, our intuitions, our gut reactions are not adapted to the modern environment. So that is the basic fundamental problem in decision making. We're taught to go with our gut, but our gut is adapted for the savanna environment. When we were hunters and foragers living in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people, so that's why when you see a box of dozen donuts, you want to eat the whole box of dozen donuts. And you should not eat the whole box of dozen donuts. You should stop, maybe one is okay, two maybe. You should stop at the third donut. But our ancient ancestors, when they came across a source of sugar, they didn't have donuts, but when they came across bananas or citrus or apples, it was important for them to eat as much as possible. That facilitated their survival, that enabled them to survive. So we are the descendants of those who were able to stuff their mouths with bananas and apples and so on, and able to incentivize to do that because that's how they survived, getting access to these resources, eating a lot of it at once. And unfortunately, since they're the ones who survived, they're the ones who passed on their genes, and including the instinct to eat as much sugar as possible. And that's really bad for us right now. We have an obesity epidemic in this country and around the world with, going on because of that. But this is an example of how we make bad decisions just because of how our brain is wired in physical health.
So we can't
that's only
help it?
one. We can help it, but our gut if we just go with our gut, we would do this primitive, savage, intuitive thing. Okay. So just going with our gut, we can manage it, and we'll talk about later about techniques to manage these things. But just going with our gut, how our feelings are, if we just go with what we feel and we're comfortable with. I mean, it's very uncomfortable to try to resist that third donut, Yes. It's hard. It takes a lot of effort. It's not easy. So you have to go really against your intuition, your feelings, your reactions, your emotions, whatever you name it, if you want to resist that third donut. So that's kind of the donuts. Okay. But much more broadly is the tribalism. So that's one of the really big problems that causes us to make terrible decisions in the modern environment. In the ancestral environment, it was very important for us to be tribal, meaning to strongly support our tribe and belong to it and conform to it. Because if we were going to be kicked out of our tribe, we'd die. And if our tribe fell apart because we weren't supportive enough of it, we would also die. So we are automatically the descendants of those who are very, very tribal, which means supporting people who look like us, who think like us, who have the same values that we do, who we feel a bond with, and opposing those because there were hostile tribes that were attacking our tribe and they want to get its territory and its food, it's bananas and apples. So that was it's donuts, right? Exactly. The donut tribe, protecting the donut factory. Exactly. So it was very important for us to be tribal in that environment. In the current environment, it's terrible. It's very damaging. The tribalism is incredibly damaging and harmful for us in this multicultural, multipolar, global society. We're getting increasingly globalized, and we have to deal with people who are very different from us. They don't look like us. They, in very many ways, don't think like us, don't feel like us. I mean, one of the biggest problems for nonprofit leaders that I coach and consult with is that they tend to hire people who are like them. And not necessarily, they try to go, let's say, for diversity. They don't hire necessarily the same skin color, the same, gender, but they hire people who think like them. Mm-hmm. And lack of cognitive diversity causes very bad decisions on a team. And we'll talk about team decision making later, but this is one of the biggest problems that I see. Lack of cognitive diversity, lack of different styles of thinking. So that's tribalism, causes a lot of bad problems. Now, another series of problems comes from another very important primal savanna impulse, and that's the fight or flight response. you might have heard of it as a saber-toothed tiger response. It was very important for us, for our ancestors, to jump at 100 shadows in order to get away successfully from that one saber-toothed tiger or to fight an attacking tribal member. You might notice that in the current environment, we have many less saber-toothed tigers. But we still tend to react to, nasty emails from, let's say, donors. So we tend to greatly overreact to them, have a very impulsive, defensive, or aggressive response. And that's very dangerous for us. It's very not good to have that. What would be much more effective is to look at the email and incorporate the constructive parts of it into our behavior, into how we have policies, have this information be part of how it informs our behavior. Write a nice email in response saying, that's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I haven't thought of it that way. And that's very hard to do. That's not an intuitive behavior at all. So that's a hard thing to do. And it's a learned behavior. So you're going from this again, in the same way that you are trying to overcome the tribalism, you're trying to overcome the fight and flight response. And there are lots of these dangerous judgment errors called cognitive biases that lead us in the wrong direction. So, following the Tony Robbins model of being primal, being primitive, being savage is very harmful for us in organizational behavior, in leadership behavior, in teamwork behavior. We need to instead change our impulses, not have that second donut or third donut, second is okay, not write the email or ignore the email from the donor in response, which, the flight response is to ignore the email, for example. Not do that.
I may or may not have engaged in that just today, actually.
There you go. We need to make sure that we hire people with cognitive diversity in our teams instead of hiring people who are just like ourselves and our styles of thinking. But that all means that you're having healthy, learned, civilized behaviors and behaviors that are adaptive to the modern environment in which you find yourself, instead of the ones that would be the best fit for the savannah environment, which is what our gut reactions and instincts push us to do.
Okay. Now I have one question. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to limit it to one because we have a limited amount of time. When it comes to hiring cognitive diversity, I'm really interested in this. Not the least of which of reasons is where my organization is we don't have a lot of racial diversity. I live in a rural part of America, and that's where my organization is. And we tend to get basically white women who want to serve on our board. If I'm trying to diversify, I can't help it that 98% of the population here is white and that about 60% is women. So that's kind of, my organization mirrors my local population. So how can those of us who might work in areas like that hire for cognitive diversity? What should we be looking for? What kind of questions should we ask?
Well, what you want to do is look at what kind of personalities and especially cognitive biases are most present in your organization and make sure that you hire people who complement your weaknesses as opposed to simply reinforcing your strengths. Because if you reinforce your strengths, your weaknesses will be twice as bad. I'll give you an example, a classic example of cognitive diversity. So take me as a person. One of my biggest cognitive biases, probably the biggest, is called the optimism bias. Now, what does the optimism bias mean? The optimism bias means that I think the future will be nice and rosy and sweet and great. I think that I tend to be risk blind, so I don't see risks. I tend to see many more opportunities and strengths than I see weaknesses and threats. I think the grass is green on the other side of the hill, even though it's sometimes yellow. I have too high expectations for other people. A lot of leaders, so I run a company, Disaster Avoidance Experts, which is a training, consulting, and coaching company, as I mentioned, 6-people company. A lot of people like me entrepreneurs like me tend to be optimistic. And a lot of organizational EDs, executive directors for nonprofits, tend to be optimistic. That is their personality trait. Now, what you want on the team in order to complement for that is someone who suffers from the opposite pessimism bias. And this is a spectrum, you have extreme optimism, extreme pessimism, and things that are moderately in the middle. But someone who tends to see the world in a negative light, who thinks that the grass is yellow on the other side of the hill, even though it's sometimes green, who tends to be risk averse. So that is the person that I want on my team and that I make sure to hire on my team, because I'm the kind of person. So what does optimism bias mean in practice? I have 20 ideas before breakfast, and I think all of them are brilliant. So there are lots of people who are like me in executive director positions in
Mhm.
nonprofits. And I know that because I coached a lot of these people. So what happens with them is that if they hire other people like them who say, yeah, these are brilliant ideas, Mary, let's go and try to execute on all of them because they all sound brilliant. You'll just disperse all your resources and you'll do some things that are good and some things that are bad. Whereas if you have someone who is a trusted leader on your team, in the COO position, the operating officer, chief operating officer, if you have that person or let's say your chief fundraiser, who often functions in smaller nonprofits as the chief operating officer as well. So that person can go and say, hey, of these 20 ideas, these three seem like these all have baked potatoes. These three seem like they're worth finishing baking. Discard the rest, bad potatoes, and finish baking them. Now, what happens with people who are pessimists is that they tend to not be very good at idea generation because they inherently see the exaggerated flaws of ideas and they intuitively shut down this process of idea generation. So if you don't have that cooperative model, now what they're good at is evaluating, judging ideas, and then fixing all the problems before the ideas are implemented. So finishing baking the potato. So what I often see in teams, we talked about teams, in nonprofits that have, let's say, a team of 10 people, or larger nonprofits, whatever, not tiny nonprofits, but nonprofits or a board. So with a board setting, nonprofits that have an active volunteer board. So what happens is that there are some optimists on the board and some pessimists. And the optimists are creating ideas and the pessimists are shooting them down. And they're fighting a lot. And that's not good. That's not a healthy way
Yeah.
of collaborating. Same thing if you have a staff, you have the same thing. Staff generating ideas, if you have a board that does mainly fundraising and rubber stamping. so if you have that style, then again you have some staff on the team who are great at having ideas and some people who are shooting them down. That's not great. What you need to do is separate the process of brainstorming, give that to the optimists, and don't have the whole team do brainstorming. Have the optimists on the team brainstorm, then individually separate the ideas from the people who create the ideas and say, here's a pool of 20 ideas without names attached to them, and give that to the pessimists to evaluate and judge, and then improve the ideas, of these pool of 20 ideas or pool of 100 ideas, these three ideas are worth taking further. And so they choose the best ideas, they fix the problems, and then they implement. And then you together work on the implementation. So that's a much better way of collaborating together. So you want to make sure that if you have optimists on your board, if you have too many optimists, you want to make sure to get some pessimists on the board, even though you might not have ethnic diversity and you didn't have, like you said, appropriate gender diversity, you might have too many optimists or too many pessimists. So whatever, you might want to make sure to get other people on the board who make up for the cognitive diversity. And the optimism bias and the pessimism bias are just two out of over 100 cognitive biases that are
Oh my
out there.
gosh. A
And
hundred? Over 100.
that's right, over 100. So you
And
can
how
take a
many
look.
do you cover in your book?
My book covers
Like
the top 30 cognitive
30.
biases that are
Okay.
dangerous, the most dangerous for organizational settings. For organizational settings, leadership settings, those are the cognitive biases I cover in the book. Now,
Okay.
there are over 100 of them altogether, and some of them have to do with things like personal relationships, which are important, but they're not so important for organizational settings.
Mhm.
So I cover the 30 most dangerous ones for organizational settings and talk about how to address them effectively. And there's an
Okay.
assessment in the last chapter of the book, chapter 7, that helps you understand which cognitive biases people on your team, or people in your workplace and your team are most prone to, and how you can specifically address them.
Yeah, I saw that and I am so excited to pull that out at my next board orientation session
Mm-hmm.
or board retreat. So we do those every fall, and I'm adding like
Perfect.
I'm getting like an increasing library of quizzes for my
Mm-hmm.
and assessments for my board members, so that I know like how to interact with each one of them and how we'll best all work together as a group. So I love that you included that in your book.
you want to go to disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe. There's a free copy of the assessment there, digital copy. So that might be more convenient
Excellent.
than just photocopying the book. So again, disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe for a digital copy of the assessments on dangerous judgment errors in the workplace.
Great. I will definitely have that in the show notes for people to click on. Well, let's talk about group decision making. So we know a couple of the pitfalls about individual decision making. Where do groups get it horribly wrong?
Well, we talked about one, optimism and pessimism bias, just so people
Mm-hmm.
understand what's going on there. Another big problem for groups is called groupthink. So,
Mm-hmm.
groupthink is a phenomenon where everyone coordinates around the opinion of the alpha male or female in the room. So, the alpha male or female, that person is the one whose voice really matters, and everyone, regardless of what they think, agrees with this person consciously or unconsciously. And so
Mm-hmm.
this is a big problem because, of
Yeah.
course, the decision making of the group will be narrowed down to this one person. That's really bad. That's very dangerous. That's harmful. So the way to deal with that is to have there are a couple of ways of dealing with that. One very helpful way, and you want to make sure to do this, is to have people express their opinions before, ideally anonymously. So have people, if you have an issue that you want to discuss, have people anonymously express their opinions, and then have everyone read the opinions of everyone else. You can have, it's easy to
Hmm.
do Google Forms, Google or SurveyMonkey, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
whatever form. I'm not affiliated with any of them, so don't get a cut. So Google Forms is free. I think SurveyMonkey is, I'm not sure. Anyway,
Yeah,
Google
it's free
Forms,
up to a certain
anonymous.
number of questions. So yeah,
There you
yeah.
go. So that's that's free. Get that. Have people fill it out about their opinions, and have
Hmm.
everyone read the results of everyone's opinions, so that everyone's opinions are out there before the big kahuna has a chance to voice their opinion. So that's one. Second, as you go around the room and discuss the topic, make sure that the person who is the alpha in the room speaks last.
Hmm.
And that's going to be really important. Not start with them, have them speak last. So that's very important, and that's something that I apply to my own. I'm the volunteer chair of a board, so I know how boards work, and I make sure that the people who are the least powerful in the room, which typically are the newest board members, they have the least experience, the least social capital within the network of board members, and I make sure that they speak first. And sometimes they're not willing to speak first, but I make sure to have them speak before me after some people speak. Ideally, they would speak first and then go around that circle. Same thing if you have a staff. Let's say you have a staff meeting and you're making a decision on an issue. You already have everyone's anonymous responses. You want to make sure that the people with less power speak first, and then it goes up to the people with more power, and the person with the most power speaks last.
Great. That is great advice. I think we've all succumbed to groupthink. On, I mean, like I've already thought of 3 different scenarios that just
Mhm.
happened over, the past couple of months. So that is super helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Um, Tell me, okay, let's talk about the training you did with the World Wildlife Fund. I'd love to hear what that was about, and what drew you to the World Wildlife Fund as a place where you wanted to, you know, work with them.
So the World Wildlife Fund, for folks who don't know, it's the largest environmental nonprofit in the world. And I really support their mission. I support their mission to conserve the earth, and I support, in general, environmental nonprofits. And I think the World Wildlife Fund, in particular, has a lot of strength because of how science-based they are. They're really science-driven. Some other environmental nonprofits are somewhat less science-driven than they are. So I like the fact that about them. And I also like the fact that they try to work with corporations and so on and polluters and try to influence them to change their behavior rather than kind of just a rah-rah direct action everywhere or something like that. So I like the fact that they're working in collaboration as part of the infrastructure and that they're effectively changing things. So those are some of the reasons I like the World Wildlife Fund. And there are others having to do with their ethical structure and governance. So for
Mm,
example, they have a structure where there is a central coordinating council and that each country independently has its own structure,
mm,
so that there's a lot of decentralization of power. And this is globally within the world. The US World Wildlife Fund, the French one, the Namibia one, all of those are independent. So I like that fact about them, kind of their structure. So that's why I like them. Now, what this training was about how to effectively engage stakeholders. And that, of course, ranges all the way from donors to operations so how do you engage donors effectively. That ranges to, let's say, if you're trying to lobby legislators, how do you effectively engage in lobbying legislators? If you're trying to influence, I don't know, media, how do you influence media? So whoever you're trying to influence, how do you influence them effectively? And for example, for the World Wildlife Fund, they had people on the food loss team in the room, and they were trying to influence chefs to waste less food in the kitchen. As you may or may not know, chefs waste a lot of food in the kitchen. Once it's there, it's pretty cheap. They don't pay anything for wasting the food, and so there's a lot of food waste that doesn't have to take place. So the people in the World Wildlife Fund, that's one area of the food loss team. Another area of the food loss team is how do you address the farmers? So engaging with farmers and trying to encourage farmers to actually waste less of their surplus product that never makes it to the store. It's often what it usually happens is that it's left on the fields to rot. And that, of course, is quite bad from the perspective of actually not wasting food. Or let's say there are people in the room who are trying to encourage Nike and trying to encourage to use less plastic. So things like this. So those are going to be some of the activities. And there were people in the room who were trying to use lobby legislators to focus on how to save various areas of the forest that would be most important for forest regeneration. Now, as you can imagine, legislators have to balance and government officials have to balance a lot of competing interests in deciding which areas of the forest to protect and which ones not to protect. So the World Wildlife Fund, one of the things that they're doing is trying to help the legislators determine that, hey, this area of the forest is especially important because it is most fundamental for the forest regenerating itself. Things like this. Because, rather than randomly pointing their finger at the map and saying, we'll protect this one, not this one.
Right.
So
Or
those
we'll
are the
protect
kinds
this
of
one
things.
because it's close to a big donor, but we're not going to protect this other one. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
You don't want to do that. So what I was teaching them was about how to do effective stakeholder engagement, how to influence people effectively, understanding that, hey, there are a lot of these cognitive biases that are going to inhibit us from effectively influencing people. So, for example, we talked about some of them already. Another one is going to be the illusion of transparency. So the illusion of transparency refers to the fact that we are much worse at communicating than we think we are. What intuitively tends to happen in our gut is that when we say something, we think the other person receives the message as we intended it to be received. Whereas in reality, the other people who hear our message are interpreting it through their own filters, whatever filters happen to be, and they miss some things. Maybe they're thinking about when can I check my phone next for an important email, or what am I going to have for breakfast? They might be distracted, right? And they might not be focusing on paying attention on exactly what you're saying. So how do you address that? Well, one way to address that is to make sure that you check occasionally that they're getting what you think they're saying. So something like after you make an important point, to say, hey, I want to make sure that I communicated effectively. So you place the onus of potential mistake on yourself, and what did you hear me say? Can you just summarize that so I understand that we are communicating effectively and that I didn't make a mistake in my communication? So that's a technique that can help you address the illusion of transparency. And so that's one of many techniques that I was teaching at the World Wildlife Fund. How do you effectively address all the errors in how we communicate and the mistakes that we tend to make when we communicate?
and I think Malcolm Gladwell talks about that same thing in his book, Talking to Strangers, how we communicate poorly because we assume what's happening on the other person's face is what we think it is obvious, and it might not be. It might be cultural differences or ethnic differences or just personality types that if you say something and I laugh at it, doesn't necessarily mean I find it funny. I may find it frightening, but my way of coping is laughing. And then suddenly we have a horrible miscommunication because I'm terrified and you think you're being hilarious.
Yep.
That illusion of transparency is a strong one. I love what you said about how to check for clarity so that you don't put the other person on the defensive. That's
Yes, a
really
lot of
smart.
this is about making sure that other people save face. And it's important in American culture, but especially important in cultures which the World Wildlife Fund engages with outside of the United States. There are many
Mm.
cultures where saving face is even more important than
Oh
in the United
yeah.
States. So it's really important to understand that, hey, culturally there might be differences. You always want to take implicit blame on yourself for any miscommunication. It doesn't cost you much to take implicit blame on yourself, but the reward is that you address miscommunication, you address problems. And then again, of course, how do you, let's say, conflict mediation, conflict resolution? How do you address conflicts? So if, for example, one of the things you can do is you can reframe an issue. If somebody is thinking about an issue from, let's say, a government official who you want to influence, is thinking about an issue from the perspective of, oh, how will I protect myself from negative political repercussions for this? You can make sure that as part of your communications, you say that, hey, we have these legislators who really support the World Wildlife Fund, and they're very excited about your efforts to protect the forest. So indicating implicitly, without being overt about it,
Mm.
that you will provide that person with political cover.
What about stakeholders that appear to be disengaged?
Mm-hmm.
How can we re-engage them?
It depends on the situation. So the first thing you want to evaluate is what motivates them, and not logic. Not you want to step away from that because motivation comes from emotions. So what are they feeling? How
Mm.
are they feeling? Try to understand what are their feelings about the topic. What might be causing their disengagement? Disengagement is an emotional issue. So disengagement, whether for donors, whether for staff members, there's a lot of staff members who get disengaged, whether for volunteers, understand what motivates their disengagement. And they may not be excited about communicating that to you. So you want to try it out. You want to try telling them various scenarios, various stories, see how they react to various scenarios, various stories, what do they seem most excited about, what do they seem least excited about, and try to create an emotional map of this person. And so that's kind of one of the instruments that I use, emotional mapping. Figure out what is the emotional map of this person, what are their values, what they care about, and it might change over time. So they might get less excited about some things, more excited about others, and to the extent that they're an important stakeholder, you want to keep track of that. And so
Yeah.
once you have this idea of what excites them, you want to target those things and you want to reduce obstacles. So they might be disengaged because let's say they're a millennial and they don't like your social media. You might have a lack of social media and they see that as a sign that your nonprofit is not, in the 21st century. Let's say that way. They see this, and that might be a problem for them because they might not be willing to tell their friends that they're volunteering or donating to a nonprofit that's not 21st century nonprofit. So they would be, and they might not be willing to tell you that. So that's something that you need to discover. You need to figure out what is bothering them, what is problematic for them, and that you want to address it over time to the extent that you care about them engaging with things. I mean, it's not that hard to have social media, to have that has 2 posts a day. It doesn't take that much time, but it's something that you need to realize. If you're engaging with people who are younger than 40, then they will care about that issue.
Yeah. Let's talk about economic behaviors and decision making around donors. So how can we help our donors decide to give us money?
Mhm. The most important thing is you've probably heard this before about storytelling. So you want to have crucial stories. You want to understand what kind of stories are in the heads of donors. So what kind of narratives do they have? And then make sure that you influence a narrative to be aligned with what you want. So if they have a narrative about you, let's go with the previous example, being a staid-old nonprofit that's not really in the 21st century, you want to change that narrative. You want to have there's a specific type of narrative that's very effective called the hero's journey, where you start with the protagonist, in this case a nonprofit, being in a state of rest, but not the best state at all. And then it's disturbed by some kind of external force, usually external force. And then it goes on a quest to change the situation and address the disturbance. In the process, it overcomes a number of obstacles, often getting help from a mentor of some sort, supporter of some sort, and in the end, it overcomes obstacles and learns and grows. So let's say you're a nonprofit that doesn't realize that by not using social media effectively, you're alienating a whole bunch of people who are younger than 40. And they may have been willing to give money earlier, but now they're not willing to give money because more and more nonprofits are moving into the 21st century. And so they have better ways of spending their money, they feel. And so you can communicate that. You could say, oh, we realize that this is a problem. So here's what we're going to do to overcome this problem. We're going to get, tap mentors, go to social media training. There's plenty of free social media training available online these days, including targeted for nonprofits. Maybe you want to get a social media consultant to specifically teach you methods that would be most effective to your nonprofit, adapt the general practices to you, and that can be a mentor sort of thing. And you would be overcoming obstacles, problems. Let's say you don't have current skills, you don't have time, and you need to decide where to cut your time from certain areas to engaging in social media. And then over time, you can have a narrative of you overcoming these obstacles and changing these things, learning about how to do social media effectively, and now you're a 21st century nonprofit that uses social media effectively regardless of your size. So, the nonprofit where I serve as the volunteer chair of the board doesn't have any staff. It's an all-volunteer nonprofit, but it posts on Instagram, it posts on Twitter, it posts on Facebook, it posts on LinkedIn twice a day on each platform. And so it's effective that way with all volunteers. So that is something that's a choice that was made to not devote energy to other areas, but devote energy to this area because it's important. Part of our target audience, and the goal of this nonprofit is spreading the research on decision making, popularizing it for a broad audience, is people who are younger than 40.
So let's give that nonprofit some love. What's the name of the organization?
Intentional Insights. So check out intentionalinsights.org. And the most important project we're running right now is called the Pro-Truth Pledge at protruthpledge.org, whose goal is to unite everyone who cares about truthfulness in a commitment to 12 truth-oriented behaviors, making sure that everyone commits to the extent they're willing to be truthful public about their truthfulness to these truth-oriented behaviors at protruthpledge.org.
Okay. We cannot escape this this discussion without diving into what are pro-truth behaviors.
Sure. So anyone who is following the nonprofit, anyone who's following the conversation can go to protruthpledge.org and check it out. So I want to make sure that it's not only me who is going for this, but if you can go to protruthpledge.org, you're welcome to check it out. So first, fact check information to confirm it's true before sharing it, before accepting it and sharing it. So fact checking is not too hard of a behavior to institute. It takes 30 seconds to fact check, but too few people fact check before accepting and sharing information, unfortunately. Then share the whole truth, even if some aspects don't support your opinion. Too many people cherry pick information instead of looking at the whole information, even some that's uncomfortable. Again, you're going outside of your comfort zone if you acknowledge, let's say right now the presidential race in the Democrats is going on. And if you happen to be a Democrat, you're likely to be, and you're supporting any candidate, you're likely to not agree fully with that candidate's views. But many people will just say, they're fully behind this candidate, they support this candidate, and not acknowledge some of the weaknesses and problems with this candidate's positions. That's bad. Not pro-truth. So, cite. Share your sources. Share your sources for whatever information to the extent that's possible that you share. That's really important. Then distinguish between your opinion and the facts. Sometimes you're going to, so if you have, let's say, you're saying that the temperature outside may be 70 degrees. So that's a fact. Now, you may feel it's cold, other people may feel it's warm, but the fact is that it's 70 degrees, and you want to distinguish that. You don't want to insist that it's warm is a fact. So that's the kind of things that we're talking about when we're distinguishing between opinions and facts. Then acknowledge when others share true information, even when you disagree otherwise. That's very important to be able to do. Right now, we have such polarization in this country, in part because lots of people from either camp say that everything that the other side says is wrong. But in reality, there's a lot that you agree on. You probably agree that you want to have safe streets, that you want your neighbors to be able to go and have some food, and likely you are going to agree on these things, very broad things. And so you want to figure out what are the areas of consensus, and as well as what are the areas of disagreement. If your information is challenged and you can't verify it, you need to retract it. So if for some reason you shared something that was not accurate, or you can't verify that it's accurate, it's challenged, just retract it. It's a basic behavior of truthfulness. Defend others when they come under attack for sharing true information, even if they don't support your opinion. So let's go into the Democratic primary again, or the Republican primary, or whatever. Yeah. If someone who you don't support shares accurate information and they're bashed for it, you want to defend them. And that's kind of part of your commitment to truthfulness, even if it's uncomfortable to defend someone with whom you otherwise disagree. Next, 8th behavior. Align your opinions and your actions with true information. Don't say that, you believe that it's cold outside and then go outside without any clothing. There are lots of people who do that for political issues or other sorts of issues. You want to make sure that you're consistent and with your actions, your opinions, and your behaviors. Next, encourage people, ask people to retract information that reliable sources have disproved, even if they're my allies. So fact-check sources, everything from Snopes to factcheck.com and other reliable sources. If your information has been disproved, retract it and encourage others to do so as well. Then compassionately inform those around you to stop using unreliable sources, even if the sources support your opinion. There are going to be a bunch of unreliable media sources out there on the left and on the right alike, which you don't want to use because they share a lot of falsehoods as well as a lot of truths. So you want to make sure to go toward the sources that care about the truth and focus on truthful information. And do not use sources that are going to share falsehoods as though those falsehoods are accurate. Next, recognize the opinions of experts as more likely to be accurate than your own. And this applies to all sorts of things. Experts, scientists, however you define expertise, and we have specific definitions of expertise, they're more likely to be accurate. Doesn't mean that they'll always be accurate, but they're more likely to be accurate than you if you're not an expert. Finally, celebrate those who retract incorrect statements and orient their beliefs toward the truth. This is going to be especially important in the political arena, as well as the leadership arena in organizations. Leaders are often punished for changing their minds, called flip-floppers, whether in organizations or in politics and whatnot. That's really bad. You want leaders who change their minds based on new information. That's the kind of behaviors you want to see. But we in our society don't encourage that. So those are the 12 truth-oriented behaviors of the Pro-Truth Pledge. And that's the commitment that a whole bunch of people, we have, I think, 4 Congress members right now who took the Pro-Truth Pledge.
Oh, wow.
By now,
4 out definitely. Of so, it's such a small number. It hurts my heart.
4 is better than none,
This is true.
So we have 4 who have taken it, so that's great. And we have, I think, over 40 state legislators and a whole bunch of organizations, and media organizations, a lot of people who have taken the Pro-Truth Pledge, who are supporting it, who are encouraging it, or going forward.
Okay, the question may sound obvious. The answer may be obvious, but I have to ask it. How important is the truth in making good decisions?
Well, the reason I got into it in the first place, into the Pro-Truth Pledge, is my specific area of expertise within the cognitive neuroscience is how do you figure out what's true and how do you convince others to believe the facts, especially how do you figure out what's true? Because you've probably heard the phrase garbage in, garbage out.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have bad information that informs decision making, you will make bad decisions. It's fundamental. So the specific peer-reviewed research I do, my specific subfield within the subfield of decision making is figuring out what is true and encouraging other people to believe the facts, to be more truthful. So that's the importance of truthfulness, of accuracy. If we don't have accurate information, we don't have truthful information, then we're going to make terrible decisions. And this in organizations is very important. Not just want to be very clear. This is I studied this in organizational settings, behavioral economics. So it applies to politics, but my research is more on the organizations because so often bad information, negative information doesn't get passed up the chain of command, or people in the top levels of the leadership like to believe positive things about themselves and their plans and their organization, and they cherry pick evidence and ignore information that doesn't confirm their beliefs. It's called the confirmation bias. So there are two cognitive biases. The confirmation bias is when you look for evidence that confirms your beliefs, ignore information that doesn't. So that's one. And then the mum effect is when negative information doesn't get passed up the chain of command because leaders at the top don't reward negative information being passed up. And so it just stays down because the people who pass up negative information don't get rewarded, they get punished.
How can we as leaders accept that negative information and help the people who work with us know that it's okay to tell us these things?
What you want to do is create a model, is create a culture of welcoming negative information, promoting people and uplifting people who share negative information. Not simply, oh hey, Mike, why do you keep bringing me these problems? But say, hey Mike, thank you, that's wonderful. I really appreciate you bringing me this information. Let's figure out what to do about it. So kind of being collaborative, and don't put the onus on Mike to figure out what to do about it. Make sure that it's part of a team effort to figure out what to do about negative information. So you want to uplift these people. Some organizations, and this is something I do for large organizations, is I make sure that they have someone as part of my consulting coaching. They have someone who gets the role of a devil's advocate, meaning someone who specifically argues against whatever the organization wants to do and so on. So it's their role, it's their job to do that. Of course, they have other jobs, but it's their role to do that. Often it's going to be people who are pessimistically inclined, so it already aligns with their personality. It really helps the organization and the board make better decisions if you have someone who is a devil's advocate, because, and there's extensive research on how teams work, and teams work much better when a decision has been argued against, rather than when everyone aligns on a decision, says, yeah, this is great. Whereas if you have someone who argues against the decision, you kind of look at the flaws and you have a chance to correct all the problems before you go ahead.
We're almost out of time, but I want to ask one more question. How do you okay, so we need to have that balance of like positive and negative, right? So that we can kind of look at something in all more objectively. How do you, if you're trying to create a culture of positivity, but you still need the sort of more negative and pessimistic elements, like it just seems like it would be hard to find that balance. How do you find harmony or balance in that? Like,
so you don't frame the negativity as negative, as bad. You frame it as problem solving. So it's not
okay.
Yes. So Mike is not bringing you bad information. Mike is bringing you an opportunity to address a problem, because the problem is already there. Regardless of whether you know about it or not.
This is true.
The donor is still unhappy regardless of whether you know about it or not. And so Mike is bringing you valuable information about the state of reality, which gives you the opportunity to solve a problem. And that's positive. That's good. It's a problem-solving opportunity, rather than Mike is bringing you negative information and Mike therefore is bad, which is what tends to happen in so many nonprofits.
Yeah, it is. Well, like my organization, we had a culture that was way more negative, and we've been shifting to a more positive culture. But now I'm finding that we tend to gloss over the things that are problems, and like you said, the problem is still there. It's just someone has to reveal it and reveal the opportunity to fix it. I love that. Thank you for that.
I want to make sure that people recognize that their intuitions, their gut reactions are going to lead them often in the wrong direction just because they're not adapted for the modern environment. So it's the reality of the situation. It feels uncomfortable and you have to go outside of your comfort zone. You not do the primitive and natural Tony Robbins thing, but do the civilized thing that's adapted to the modern. That's the essence of civilization, that you are adapted to the modern environment. You do counterintuitive things. Otherwise, why have civilization? Everyone would just be living along in a nice state of harmony. But you do the counterintuitive things, the hard things that enable us to live in a complex, multicultural, multipolar, global environment. And so that is what the book enables you to do. And I hope you check it out, and I hope it enables you to do that.
Thank you once again, Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. And if you, the listener, would like to get in touch with him or just learn more about him or find his book, please check the show notes. All of the links are there. Thank you so much for listening this week. If you like this podcast, please be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share with a friend. If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at Becky Brett Caldwell for daily inspiration, information, and support. I've started doing daily Labyrinth Oracle card readings to inspire and guide my community. I mean, I may be new to the woo, but it turns out I'm pretty good at this. So of course I want to share it with you. More big changes are coming to the podcast, which I'll announce in August. But for now, enjoy the journey. And remember, you can lose yourself in a maze, but you can find yourself in a labyrinth.